Well, a warm welcome to everyone here in the loft, out there in the Zoom room, and watching on the video. As with last session, I would like to again acknowledge and welcome those who are here but not here, the so-called dead. Those who may be deceased but do not desist. And you may want to do that yourselves wherever you are, to take a moment to acknowledge the presence of loved ones, friends, interested people in the larger human populace who accompany us, often in the unconscious, but nonetheless work with us here in this realm of human activity. So welcome, welcome. Come in and be a part of the human soul warmth here on Earth. I want to start with a story. A few months back, I noticed someone had taken spray paint and wrote on the stone gate to the park where I live and go past frequently. They had sprayed, "Men are trash." Men are trash. And a few weeks later, I noticed someone had taken another color of spray paint and added the word all, making the statement, "All men are trash." Then a while later, another addition was made to this dialogue with the words, "You are too." This is not exactly on the level of the dialogos, which I think cosmic intelligence intended when there was a split, right, in the genders of our species, as I spoke of in a previous session, that this gender split that took place was not just to make procreation more fun and interesting, but to make connecting, conversing, communing with each other more fun, interesting, and of course, challenging us to evolve as humankind through a dialogos, leading us to higher consciousness. So this very public dialogue being carried out with spray paint, which is still there, where people are trashing each other, is not really leading anywhere other than perhaps releasing some anger and resentment, even perhaps wreaking some vengeance. And of course, it is possible to react this way, but these sorts of emotions are more of a downward spiral than a dialogos, which should really raise the vibe, raise consciousness, and ultimately raise humanity on its ascension, while higher consciousness endeavors to descend down into the vessel of humanity. I also saw recently a bumper sticker that said coexist, but it wasn't just the word coexist. The letters of the word were made up of the religious symbols of the world. So the Islamic crescent moon was used for the C, the peace sign for the O, the Hindu Om symbol for the E, the Star of David for the X, and a pentacle for the dot of the I, a yin-yang symbol for the S, and a Christian cross for the T. And I thought, well, this is very clever. And for a moment, I wanted one. But then I reflected on what I've been presenting in Human Not by Nature, and how we're evolving away from some of these past supports, like the ancient religions. We are individuating. We are separating. And we may even be all spiritually connected to the soul of Father Abraham, which I spoke about in a previous session, the one father, the patriarch who spawned a spiritual lineage that became the factions of Judeo-Christian Islamic religions, which have themselves all become factions within themselves. And that is the point. The intention of the cosmic intelligence is for there to be separation, to be individuation, as Jung calls it, or as Steiner has stated, each human eventually becoming its own species. Or as Goethe put it, all separation takes place so there can be unification of a higher order. So I didn't buy the bumper sticker because really the emphasis now is more on the individuation of the individual, that we're really trying to coexist, not as religious factions, but as individual species living together on this planet. So I don't know if promoting the idea of coexistence between the factions of mass religions is really the public statement I want to make with a bumper sticker. Religion has its place. But Steiner coined the term ethical individualism to suggest that rather than relying on religion to guide our life through an external code of conduct, we each need to find our guidance from within ourselves. That there is no longer any one-size-fits-all code of behavior. And when we all learn to work with the cosmic intelligence, descending into the vessel of our self, there will be harmonious coexistence among all human individuals. But this spray paint dialogue has a twist of irony to it and got me thinking about how far we have fallen in this age. How in one sense, we have all been trashed with the meat and machine model of our science of the hour. Meat and machine model. The ancient priesthoods taught and treated humanity as spiritual beings, having a human experience. But today, the new priesthood of scientists, if you will, see people as meat and machine. When you go to see the doctor, they treat you with this meat and machine model. Does the doctor enter into a dialogos with you? Do they support you in processing what is going on for you? How much do they address what is going on the level of your consciousness beyond the meat and machine? They can't. They can't because they're not trained to in the Western medical meat and machine model. If you're struggling mentally or emotionally, what will they do? Generally, they'll refer you to another specialist, a psychiatrist. And what will they do? Well, being trained in the same meat and machine model, they will endeavor to tweak the meat machine, most often through chemical intervention. Why? Because belief is the basis of behavior. If you believe in the mechanical model of the universe, then that is how you're going to treat it. You will treat your patient in a mechanical way and give little regard as to what can be done on the level of their consciousness. Or the opposite may also take place. A person can spend years going for appointments with a psychologist, psychotherapist, psychiatrist, and make very little progress. They keep talking about things. On one side of the desk, you have the expert. On the other side of the desk, you have the patient. And the patient often has to be very patient because they could spend years in this mode based on this model. It's not entering into a dialogos where you don't just talk about something, but you talk from the space of the logos, which is why I am a fan of this method developed by Eugene Genlin called focusing. Focusing is something I teach in my spiritual boot camp and have given dozens of copies of this book to others because its power gets right to the point. It allows people to unpack what's going on inside them in their consciousness from their own cosmic intelligence. It taps in to the logos, the cosmic intelligence, through engaging in a dialogos. So this spray paint statement, all men are trash, I had to ironically agree with. That humanity has been trashed, reduced in a reductionist model to where if you took all the chemical constituents of a human body to a chemist, they would give you less than $10 for it. That's right. You're worth about $10 in this materialistic model we're currently saddled with. For our ancestors, the earth was our mother, Gaia, and the heavens was considered our father, as seen when Jesus looked up and called out to the heights, Abba, Father. And all of humanity, all of us, including the held back humans in the mineral, plant, and animal realms, are offspring of this cosmic dialogos and marriage between the heavens and earth. How far we have fallen in today's way of looking at ourselves. But humanity constantly needs to renew its understanding in order to evolve. And this is the why for of the current scientific age. We have to figure things out anew for ourselves over and over. So that's what we're going through right now. But what I'm doing here right now is to try and expedite that for us as individuals who want to go beyond the box of the current model. And so we've been wrestling with the questions. Are we simply a higher primate? Are we just a meat and machine mechanical factory? Are we really just a product of DNA? Are we just lumbering robots, as scientists as eminent as Richard Dawkins suggests? In the first session, I showed a series of pictures that could all equally represent what life on Earth looks like. These are pictures I showed back in an early session. Different representations of what the Earth looks like. All equally valid. Here's a picture of the Earth from outer space. Here's a picture of the Earth, a globe, as you might find in a school classroom. Equally valid. It's a round ball with colorful countries on it. Another picture of what life on Earth looks like. Einstein there, of course, putting his famous formula on a classroom blackboard. Equally valid. Here's a picture of a mother nursing a child. Beautiful image of what life is like. Being mothered, nurtured, so to grow, be alive. And another one. Love the connection here, the organic connection, the roots, really the nervous system, the livingness connecting mother and child. Another one equally valid, showing a butterfly emerging from its chrysalis. And here's an interesting alchemical drawing from the Middle Ages, showing some alchemist crossing the threshold from one side to the other. And the reason I'm showing these pictures is to make the point that it's so important to get the right picture in mind, not just half-truths. Like a film camera, the picture you hold in your mind is what will develop in your life, manifest in the world. The importance of image is important that because it will direct the flow of your life forces. What you hold in mind, the picture. But these pictures are also the basis of what we believe. And we know belief is the basis of our behavior. So having the right image in mind is important. And creating your own image is also very important, rather than having it handed to you already finished, which is why the use of your imagination is imperative in order to be able to cognize fully and powerfully, which is why the arts are so important and should be an essential part of education, and especially as part of the science curriculum. I'm into education, especially good education, as trained as a Waldorf school teacher, where cultivation of the imagination starts right in the beginning of the curriculum and carries right on through to the very end. It's always included. As Einstein said, imagination is more important than knowledge. Knowledge is limited. Imagination encircles the world. Unfortunately, the current science curriculum in most places has very little of that. Cultivation of the imagination, inspiration, and intuition are considered heretical under the watchful eye of the new priesthood. And therefore, the inner eye is kept closed. And then we are presented with a picture of a universe that is apparently deaf, dumb, and blind, that is dead and lifeless. Nothing spiritual or living about it. And why wouldn't we accept that model blindly? We're treated as deaf, dumb, and blind spiritually. So the universe must be deaf, dumb, and blind. There is no cosmic intelligence, just random chaos and blind mutations that somehow led to us, who are deaf, dumb, and blind. We have experts who look upon past cultures as if they were nothing but superstitious beliefs. So-called experts, specialists, they're called, looking through a completely materialistic mentality and foist on the public, for example, things like the official government approved narrative that the Great Giza Pyramid is nothing more than a tomb for a king and queen, because there are two empty chambers inside. That's all they can imagine the pyramid was built for. But their logic breaks down immediately when you look at the thousands of pyramids built around the world over the ages, most of them with no chamber inside, just a solid rock structure. What's going on there? But the experts cling vehemently to their position because they don't want to imagine that there's anything spiritual about these pyramids. They can't measure it. And unfortunately, they can't feel it either, because they've had that side trained out of them. So we get presented half-truths, lacking anything of a spiritual nature. And anyone suggesting something of a spiritual nature, perhaps that these structures invited a spiritual presence, a fractal of the cosmic intelligence, is called a pseudoscientist. You've probably seen that online. This is the kind of warring set up by our current educational system. I think it's fine if a physician, a doctor working with the physical body, wants to make statements about the physical body and the atomic, molecular, mechanical aspect of it, talking about genes, DNA, and all that. But then they should humbly defer to people like Dr. Jung, a soul doctor, working on another level, and let him speak openly about the things that he's discovering and researching. Or Dr. Steiner, you could call him a spiritual doctor, working on another level again, to defer to what he's researching and speaking of, rather than calling these people pseudoscientists, which happens quite frequently. We don't need this immature name calling that happens online. In fact, I think most of science today is, in a way, pseudoscience. It's not real science. It's not really full science yet, coming to bloom of its full potential, which will only take place when the minds doing scientific research are trained in a new way, in a way that allows the mind to be open to a larger reality. So in a sense, to be trained in a spiritual science and not just a materialistic science. The science of today is still very young, very immature. And in that immaturity, there's naturally an arrogance that thinks everything is wrong except what can be proven. You can't prove there's life after death, so it can't exist, right? Well, science can't prove that life after death doesn't exist either. And a real science and scientists would accept that rather than deny it the way it does, dismissing what all our ancestors believed as simply quaint and superstitious. I wonder what our ancestor friends on the other side think of that, having their beliefs dismissed as quaint and superstitious. Actually, much of science has grown to become the opposite of what it thinks it is. This sort of thing happens in life. You become the thing that you rail against. Much of science has become faith-based. Some call it scientism, the work of Rupert Sheldrake. It's based on numbers and theories, but it is a matter of how you interpret those numbers, which, like religion, it's all up to how you interpret the holy roll, the holy scroll. And so we're handed images of ourselves as if they're settled science, but are really a matter of faith, not proof. And unfortunately, a lot of this is leading to the destruction of the earth due to the ignorance it perpetuates. What I mean by this is that because of the reductionist pictures being presented that are thoroughly replete of any spiritual element, including that the dead no longer live just because they no longer have biological life, as I looked at in the last session, we're really being put under a ceiling that shouldn't be there, that doesn't have to be there. And if you do your own work, it won't be there. Further to that, there are other unsolved scientific mysteries that we need to look at here in our final session here, called Jung, Steiner, and I. The scientific mindset struggles with explaining how something inanimate gave rise to something animate. Well, it didn't. We know that something that is lifeless cannot give rise to something alive. Therefore, logically speaking, all life must be born of something alive. The living cosmic intelligence. This was looked at in the earlier sessions, as was the question of whether humans arose out of lower beings, such as primates, which, remember, Steiner said is a thoroughly false idea. It's a misrepresentation of the total reality of what is actually taking place. We know something lesser developed does not give rise to something more highly developed. Something more highly developed gives rise to something lesser developed. And then the lesser developed thing can evolve to become more highly developed. But it starts with something higher developed. It's actually pretty simple to comprehend. But as Steiner says, we are lacking the ability to comprehend by not using the fullness of our being. We become stuck using half of our brain power, the other half being blindsided by most modern education, by vehemently insisting that the other side of the brain stay out of the classroom. And this left brain dominance has led to what I call the dark side of the brain. Which leads us to another significant scientific conundrum. Our science of the day is pretty fixated on the idea that we think with our brains. Sure, we can do all sorts of things to put on electrodes and measure brain activity when a person is thinking or responding to some stimuli. But saying it's purely the brain that is doing it is like looking at a sailboat sailing across the water and saying that it's the sail that's doing it. It's not the sail that's moving the boat across the water. The sail is catching what is going on around it. The sail simply responds to the wind and does something with it. The sail does not move the boat, the wind does. And the sail is the piece of equipment that interfaces between the wind and the boat. It's as simple as that. The brain's working the same way. It's an interface between the realm of thought and the physical body. And interestingly, this analogy is quite good, as the wind is invisible. You can't see it. It's only when it's reflected off of something that its power becomes visible and tangible. Likewise, thought is invisible, and it takes place in invisible parts of ourselves. But when it interfaces with the brain, it can become manifested in the physical realm. But you don't think with your brain. You don't even need a brain to think. This comes from Rudolf Steiner's work as well, who said in a 1922 lecture, quote, "One is attacked from all sides today if one says it is nonsense that the brain thinks. For it is agreed everywhere that the brain thinks, and that where there is no brain, there can be no thinking, that there are no thoughts where no brain exists." Well, from my lectures, you will see that the brain naturally plays its part in and has a significance for thinking. But if those people who in fact make little use of their brains claim that the brain is a sort of machine with which one thinks, then there is mere thoughtlessness. And in this lecture, Steiner goes on to give some examples, which I won't go into here. But think of it. For the so-called dead who don't have a brain, they can still have consciousness. They can still cognize. They can even still recognize. They can recognize you without having a physical brain. And they don't have physical eyes or ears either. It may be hard for some to imagine, but we need to imagine it. If it's true that those who have departed their physical body still have much to offer in support of Earth's evolution, then we need to wake up the parts of ourselves that are invisible and can recognize what's going on in the invisible realms without the use of our brain. To use our invisible parts to stay connected to the invisible realm. In a word, to connect our field to the field of the living cosmic intelligence. When Jung referred to the collective unconscious, it didn't mean it was meant to stay unconscious, that it would remain unconscious, but rather work needs to be done to make these things that are unconscious more conscious. Moving from the brain to the heart, there is another great scientific mystery regarding the heart. Again, conventional science, for all its great achievements over the centuries, has sold us short, devaluing the heart to nothing more than a pump. Rudolf Steiner is emphatic that getting the right image in mind of the heart is essential in order for humanity to evolve correctly. Remember, the picture you hold in mind is what will develop in you, like in a camera. To think of the heart as a pump is another thoroughly false idea perpetuated by the science of the moment. And science knows it. Science knows it's impossible for the heart to do what it says it is doing, that for its size, it supposedly pumps the volume of blood that flows through the body day after day, year after year, beat by beat. Rudolf Steiner, who is not given to unscientific thinking, is quite clear on the matter that the heart is not a pump, and in fact says the blood drives the heart, not the heart, the blood, close quote. And this is scientifically verifiable. The fact of the matter is that the blood is flowing in the embryo even before the heart is formed. How is this so? What is the driver of the blood then? One could use simple deductive logic. If it's not the center, the heart center, then it must be something in the periphery. And that is entirely correct. Even on the physical level, the pumping action is coming from the periphery. Have you ever considered how sap is pumped up and down a tree? The tree doesn't have a heart, doesn't have a pump. But surely the lifeblood of the plant spirals up and down the core of the tree. It's being done by forces in the periphery, the forces of nature, the cycles of the seasons, and ultimately the power of the sun itself. Likewise, the sap in your body is being pumped by peripheral action, by every cell in the body. Every cell is alive and sending and receiving blood and sending it back to the heart with its own spin and pumping action. And this takes a huge burden off the heart, which is actually more of a ram pump that stops the flow of the blood, says Steiner. The heart blocks the flow of the blood, builds up pressure until the pressure is released, allowing the blood to flow into the chambers, which then cause the blood to spiral out again into the body. And this vortexing is an important function of the heart and a big clue to this mystery. There's a lot more that can be said about how the heart is not a pump, and I've actually got a whole talk on it on my YouTube channel, Spiritual Science as Social Activism, which you're welcome to go and look up. But for now, let's just say the way the brain is really a relayer and reflector of things taking place on an invisible level, so too is the physical organ of the heart a reflector of what is taking place on an invisible level. It mirrors the flow of the universe, the space-time continuum. This is why the blood flows in space in a continuum of rhythmical time. It's a reflection of the flow of the universe. This is what actually moves your lifeblood. This is why the universe must be alive, and why you're considered alive until your heart stops. It is the livingness of the macrocosmic universe reflected in the heart center of every microcosmic being. In a sense, the universe is fractal. Something of the larger is reflected in the lesser, making the lesser alive. And it's also why the Big Bang Theory, trying to explain another great scientific mystery, is another thoroughly false idea. The Big Bang Theory has become quite fashionable as a belief these days, proudly touted as the scientific explanation of the origins of the universe. But to be clear, not every scientist accepts it as fact, as a settled science. In fact, it's another example of how science can turn into its opposite, and in some ways is becoming more like a religion, where people don't actually have experience of these things, but take on faith the interpretation of the holy scrolls of numbers by the scientific priesthood. In this case, it's the interpretation of numbers being gathered through the Hubble telescope. And so as the theory goes, some 13 billion years ago, starting from a point thousands of times smaller than the point of a pin, there was a great explosion, a big bang, which began a big expansion. And all mass and energy emanating from this pinpoint, leading to the manifestation of everything, including you and me. Until one day, the expansion will run out of steam, a universal recession will hit, contracting everything back into nothingness, with a big crunch, as it's called, then it's all over. All gone, all meaningless. Interestingly, this sounds similar to another religious doctrine that millions believe, and almost sounds like it was borrowed from it, but left the spiritual side out. In the Hindu religion, the universe was created by Brahma. Following this beginning, it is the power of Vishnu who preserves the world as part of the cycle of birth, life, and death. And it is Shiva who will ultimately destroy the universe. Furthermore, Hindus believe that creation emanates from the primordial sound Aum, Aum, A-U-M. And each letter symbolizes the cyclical nature of nature itself as a movement from birth to death. The A representing the beginning of the cycle, the U representing the middle of the cycle, and the representing the end of the cycle, followed by a pause of silence before the cycle begins again. So Aum is considered the bija, the sacred seed sound which created all the universe and all other sound vibrations in the universe. Aum was the original vibration that created all patterns of the manifest. And the Vedas describe the sound as the unmanifested state that became manifest. Sounds a bit like the Big Bang Theory. But in this case, the universe didn't have a beginning. It's just that there was an invisible aspect, the spiritual side of the universe, that became material or manifest. But science wants to skirt around this, so it gives the answer that really just produces a lot of unanswerable questions. Like, what was before and around this tiny pinpoint from which everything supposedly emerged? There's no answers because there's no inclusion of a spiritual dimension. The Vedanta cosmology speaks of the continual renewal of life through ongoing cycles of time. So I'm going to share a bit of what I believe. The universe is not expanding and then one day contracting back on itself, collapsing to size thousands of times smaller than a pinpoint. It's ridiculous. I think the nature of the universe is to be expanding and contracting all the time. The macrocosm is alive and is expanding and contracting like a heart because it's alive. And expansion and contraction is the fundamental gesture of something that's alive, along with the spiral gesture. And the most amazing thing about this is that this expansion and contraction is happening simultaneously all the time. Simultaneously. Because the universe is infinite and eternal. And I believe science will eventually come to this amazing conclusion. It is only in the temporal microcosm here on Earth where things are temporary spatially and follow linear time that we see the simultaneous expansion and contraction of the universe played out sequentially. What is happening simultaneously all the time in the universe is being played out here in the temporal realm sequentially. Where do we see that? We see that everywhere. But most especially, and closest to home, you see it in your own heart. It is in your sequential beating of your heart and lung we experience that the universe is alive and pulsing. But for it is not through chronological time. In the universe, it's eternal time. So expansion and contractions happening all the time simultaneously, but played out sequentially here in the temporal realm. And so we can say the invisible, peripheral, simultaneous expansion and contraction of the universe is what causes your blood to flow, which is the driver of your heart, as Steiner said. It is the heart of the universe that is awakening, coming alive in you. You as a microcosm of the macrocosm. And add some reverse engineering to this explanation. We see in ourselves the threefoldness of our nature, threefold, not only having a heart center, but also a brain center and a metabolic reproductive limb center, which makes visible the invisible capacities we have of thinking, feeling, and willing. The three physical centers make visible invisible centers, our soul capacities, as they're called by Steiner and Jung, of thinking, feeling, and willing. Does this not mirror the fact that the cosmic intelligence that produced us is also threefold? That it also has something of a thinking, feeling, and willing capacity. Why not? How can what produced us have anything less than what it produced? Our brain and nervous system is a condensation of the cosmos thinking capacity. Our heart, lungs, and blood is a condensation of the cosmos feeling capacity. And our metabolic reproductive limb system is a condensation of the cosmos will capacity. And if you want to go even more esoteric, Eastern Vedanic teaching, you could say the coiled kundalini at the base of the spine is the condensation of the willpower of the universe. We need to get back to the phenomenon in our sciencing and see what the phenomenon itself is showing us. This will help us to think correctly as Thardists. And this is the best thing we can do before we die, to get the story and picture correct about ourselves. We're going to take a little art break here. Time for an art exercise. So I invite everybody to get a piece of paper and a pencil crayon. We're going to begin with just a dot in the middle. So put a dot there, and then not too far away, maybe about an inch, another dot. And then you can see how these dots can be connected with a line. One dot, two dot, and then a line in between. And then we place a third dot, equidistant, and connect the third dot with the second dot, and also the first dot. And voila. Out of that emerges an equilateral triangle, which is the strongest geometric form in the universe. I'm going to now add another dot, and then connect that dot with two other dots. Continuing with another dot, equidistant from two other dots, adding two more lines, making another equilateral triangle. Doesn't have to be perfect. I'm not looking for perfection, we're looking for the experience. going to put another dot. Anywhere, really, you can put an equidistant dot and connect more of these triangles. We are working with geometry, but we also are working with something of a livingness that's there. But you might be noticing something about this, because you might observe that something that started as a center point, a singularity, that then had a second single point that was joined together, and then a third created this equilateral triangle, the strongest form, geometric form in the universe. And as we continued to add more single dots and to line them up, it's turned into something that's pretty much circular. If it was done perfectly, it would be approaching a perfect circle. The more and more we did it, the more we would be approaching a perfect circle. So one of the points about this is that every form, as you continue to add more dots, more single points, aspires to become a circle. From a center, it will grow out to be a circle. And that's kind of a nice analogy of what we're considering here as individual points, individuals joining up with other individual points, that is becoming a growing circle. So continue if you want. I'm going to continue with another little story. I regularly go to a drum circle to reinstate the sense of rhythm in myself, and recently had to laugh when two new girls sat at the drums next to me. One of them was Asian and the other African ancestry. And the African girl said, "I don't know how to play this thing." And the Asian girl replied back, "What are you talking about? It's in your blood." And it got me thinking about what our blood is really about. Another great mystery. Again, the science of the moment has discovered a lot about our blood. It's discovered DNA and mapping the genome, extending Darwin's theory of evolution and natural selection, of how outside forces determine what traits are carried forward. And this discovery of DNA has evolved into Darwin's theory into a neo-Darwinism, which includes information about how traits are inherited and passed forward, determined by inside forces. It's all incredible revelations, but these revelations of science need to be kept in context of the bigger picture, or else we're going to end up again with thoroughly false ideas. The study of genetics is slowly morphing further into the science of epigenetics, which simply is to say we are not just slaves of our genes, but we're also the master of our genes. It raises the question, are we the result of DNA code, or is DNA coding the results of us? Perhaps the genome is just a glorified read-write medium, and we have the power to read and write to the genome medium to change the coding of our DNA. And this is what's emerging through the understanding of epigenetics. And this is akin to what is developing in the field of psychoimmunology and understanding the power of the placebo effect. We're seeing we've got a lot more power than imagined or being told. But the big question is how? How to tap into this greater power? What's going to guide this process? Is it the power itself? The power of the cosmic intelligence that will guide us in tapping into this greater power? This points even more to our microcosmic center, the center of centers, our heart center. The heart center as your center in the universe, as a center of love. The heart, much more than a pump, is also the moral center of our being. Because the love in our heart and the principle of love is what will guide us morally. Or as Jesus taught, the golden law of the universe. Do unto others as you would have done unto you. So the heart is a moral organ, which we're going to need more and more as free will beings exercising our ethical individualism. Because life is a moral minefield, right? Things blow up. So the heart center can act as our moral compass upon the moral minefield of life. And Steiner says that ultimately our body will manifest our inherent morality. You might say our DNA will encode our morality. And that as we evolve to become our own species, our physicality will increasingly become an expression of our morality, says Steiner. But our form will take on new shapes as we evolve based on what we think, what we hold in our inner life, what kind of person we are morally. And Steiner also says our moral center is what will guide us in our evolving relationship with technology, which we looked at in depth 2 sessions back. We can't turn back in our growing intimacy with technology, but we can keep it on track by keeping our moral advancement in pace with our technological advancement, which is why we have to imagine and picture the heart as something much more than just a pump. In the words of Rudolf Steiner, quote, "The mechanical and the moral must interpenetrate each other, because the mechanical is nothing without the moral." There is a saying from the Cheyenne people of North America: our first teacher is our own heart. I love that. Our first teacher is our own heart. This speaks of the role of the heart and the role of love in evolution. Love is the highest guiding principle, just as the sun is the highest guiding principle of all growth and evolution. It is the light of the world. And now you and your love are to be the light of the world, quite literally. As Jesus said in the Gospel of Matthew, you are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hid. Neither do men light a candle and put it under a basket, but on a candlestick, and it gives light unto all. So let your light shine before all. Who is Jesus talking to? Who or what is the candle? You. The I am in you. The human I is the candle, or the ion, as Jung called it, AION. We referred to the I as the ion. Steiner called it the I am, or the higher ego self. which is why the session is called Jung, Steiner, and I. Jung, Steiner, and I. This is what life is about. Do you ever wonder why it's not more obvious what life is about? Why it's not more evident that there is a meaning to life, a cosmic intelligence at work in the world, working within you, your eye? Why there isn't a big billboard like a satellite in space encircling the planet telling us plainly why we're here, so we'd be more motivated and more directed instead of fumbling around in the dark? It's because part of the purpose is that we're to become free will beings. The I must have the freedom to choose to know or not. How else can we be free if we're being told what to do? The greatest mysteries of life can only be solved in you by the I. By the I freely choosing to do so and freely becoming activated, which means more than just taking a thought and incorporating it into some taken on faith belief system. We need to become great artists of thought artists or thartists, working it through, processing it through the 7 life processes, as I showed in the couple of sessions back. 7 life processes that we need to work with in order to really be thought artists that take an idea, to breathe it in, to consume it, then to warm it, to digest it, then to nourish ourselves by assimilating and integrating its essence, secreting something out of that, or elimination, maintaining our self as a body, soul, and spirit organism, growing on these 3 levels of ourselves, and then actually generating, reproducing, or creating through our physical, soul, and spiritual nature. That's the kind of activity that's required, that we can become free or not. We are left free because we're meant to be free. But doing this sort of activity to become activated, this is what will allow the I to be not only activated, but initiated into the greater mysteries that are beyond the scope of conventional scientific methodology. And that is the greatest mystery of them all. And that is where the real work lies. That's why I worked hard at preparing these presentations, not only this past year with the empathy with nature, but the year before, the research I did for the School of Love. And before that, all the presentations I've done for the Spiritual Science as Social Activism series. This is I, not settling for the answers of the hour, the science of the day, but going beyond to truly resolve these riddles within myself. Because that's the only place each individual can get the answers, not through some sort of scientific journal. It's through the work and the activation and the initiation that the real deep answers can come. That's the only place it can come together within you. And when you put things together within you, guess what? You put you together. It's putting you together. That's when real power awakens and the universe will respond to you. So don't settle for anything less. As Steiner said, quote, "A person who finds everything comprehensible may, of course, see no need to know anything of more deeply underlying causes. But to find everything in the world comprehensible is a sign of illusion and merely indicates superficiality. In point of fact, the vast majority of things in the world are incomprehensible to the ordinary consciousness. To be able to stand in wonder before so much that is incomprehensible in everyday life, that is really the beginning of a true striving for knowledge. So don't settle for less. Don't settle for superficiality. Realize that a lot is incomprehensible with ordinary mental consciousness. And we have to step up with a higher form of consciousness in a true striving for knowledge. Another story before we start to close out. A story from the epic Gospel of John about a man named Nicodemus who came to Jesus one night seeking answers to life's mysteries. And Jesus straight up told him, unless a person be born again, they cannot know the great mysteries. Nicodemus questioned back, how can a person be born when they're old? Can they enter a second time into the mother's womb to be born again? Jesus answered, truthfully, I say unto you, except a person be born of water and of spirit, they cannot enter into the kingdom of God. That which is born of the flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the spirit is spirit. Marvel not that I say unto you, you must be born again. Further, Jesus said, the wind blows where it goes, and you hear the sound, but you cannot tell where it came from or where it goes. So it is with everyone who is born of the Spirit. Jesus is speaking about a second birth, not a physical birth. That was our first birth, born of the flesh. He's speaking of a spiritual birth, the birth of the I, the higher I. He's speaking of spiritual initiation. To be born again is for us to give birth to a second nature, a higher nature capable of higher consciousness, of cosmic intelligence that can see then the distinction between our physical manifest reality, which we know only too well, and the invisible spiritual realities that inform it. Steiner said the same thing in his teachings, quote, humans have hoped to satisfy their quest for knowledge without initiation. And so they gradually came to believe that only the physical world was their field of inquiry. But what is the physical world in reality? We shall not come to terms with it if we consider only its physical aspect. We only understand the physical world when we're able to apprehend the spirit that informs it. Humanity must recover this knowledge once again. For today, we stand at the crossroads. Preparation consists fundamentally in listening to the voice of the Spirit that can still be heard amid the clamor of our materialistic age. Steiner didn't say listen to the voice of governments. He didn't say listen to the voice of big pharma. He didn't even say trust the science. He said listen to the voice of the Spirit, if you can, amid the clamor of our materialistic age. He said it takes initiation, which is a fancy word simply meaning the activation of yourself, your I, your own cosmic intelligence, which means building it. Build it by getting the right pictures inside. And these pictures are determined by what we consume. What we consume is what will commune. What we consume is with what will commune. And we want communion with the cosmic intelligence, which is not going to arise through random mutations, but rather through esoteric initiations. At the Last Supper, on the eve before Jesus took the next step in his initiation to bring about a higher birth in his spiritual existence, he told his students, "Whenever you eat or drink, think on me." Why did he say that? What did he mean? Whenever you eat or drink, think on me. He said, whenever we are consuming something, think on him. Think on Jesus? No. To think on the higher consciousness that he represented, the higher I, the I am, the higher human nature. Why? So they could build higher consciousness within themselves, which is why this is sometimes referred to as the Christ consciousness. But it's bigger than that. He was telling them, just as they are materially building themselves with bread and wine, building the anamaya kosha, the sheath made of food, to also build higher aspects. Because with what we consume is with what we commune. And within the lower ego is the spiritual kernel of the higher self. And it's through the consummation and transmutation of lower substance that the higher can be built and edified. This is all alchemical. I spoke in the last session about the consuming and transmuting nature of our relationship with the so-called dead, and to think of the dead while reading a book, while consuming its contents. Jesus said to think on him after he died. Think of the higher nature, the higher I. This is transmutation, consummation, and transmutation of the highest order. Which is why I'm feeling inspired, as I finish this series tonight, Human Not by Nature, to begin work on another series for the fall called Humans for Hire. Humans for Hire, the gospel according to Steiner, Jung, Yogananda, and Hubbard. Steiner, Jung, Yogananda, and Hubbard are four of the top contemporary teachers I've ever encountered. All of them passed away now, but each leaving an incredible legacy for the future that especially speaks to the importance of the human I, of which, if correctly interpreted, the teachings of the Gospels give many clues. And so in the next series, starting in the fall, Humans for Hire, and you can take the word hire with both spellings, H-I-G-H-E-R or H-I-R-E, I will look at the Gospels according to Steiner, Jung, Yogananda, and Hubbard. Steiner's book, The Fifth Gospel, sheds light on the four Gospels by going to the most authoritative source of truth, the Akashic record itself, which is what he meant by the fifth gospel. In Jung's work, he refers to the archetypes encrypted in the Bible, and central is the I, or I am, which, as I said, he refers to as the ion, which is the title of one of his books, Ion. And I'll be referring to Ion as part of this new series where he analyzes the archetypes in the scriptures. Paramahansa Yogananda is another great teacher who is famous for his book, Autobiography of a Yogi, who, like Steiner, did much to bridge the Eastern and Western teachings and did incredible work in interpreting the Gospels and other parts of the Bible from an Eastern perspective, which is only right because the Bible is an Eastern text and can't really be understood through a Western mentality. So we'll be delving into some of his works, including the Yoga of Jesus, as well as his epic 2-volume set, The Second Coming of Christ, The Resurrection of the Christ Within You. And Barbara Marx Hubbard, who did and wrote some incredible things before passing across just 3 years ago. I've been deeply inspired by her work, including her book, The Evolutionary Testament of Co-Creation, which I'll be drawing from. And there's a nice picture of her. You might recognize her from some of her online video presence. So in this upcoming series, we'll definitely counter the idea that all men are trash, and we'll be affirming our cosmic origin, the cosmic origin of our I. And it will also establish your I as the new #1 wonder of the world, topping out the great Giza pyramid, which is much more than an extravagant tomb, and you're much more than an extravagant tomb as well, but rather a power spot on the earth. You are the #1 wonder of the world, power spot on the earth. At the end of the previous series I did, called The School of Love, I said I wanted to be remembered as the professor of love. Remember that? Professor of love. At the end of this series, I'd like to go even further, and I'd like to change my name. I'd like my first name to be Foster. Foster. And I'd like my last name to be Love. So when people refer to me, they have to say Foster Love. Every time I'm remembered, people will have to say to each other, oh yeah, Foster Love. Remember, Foster Love. Foster Love. So as I bring this session to a close, Jung, Steiner, and I'd like to leave you with a quote from Rudolf Steiner regarding love. And after the quote, I will give the last human assignment for this series. Then there will be time for any Q&A or comments, followed by some music. So this quote from Steiner points to the transmutation of lower egocentricity and self-indulgence to the power of being other-oriented, otherwise known as empathy. Quote, only a genuine concern of each human for their neighbor can bring salvation to humanity. The characteristic feature of this epoch of consciousness is isolation. That is, inwardly isolated from each other as consequence of individuality. But this separative tendency must have a reciprocal pole, and this counterpole must consist in the cultivation of an active concern of every person for their neighbor. This awakening of an active concern for others must be developed ever more consciously. End of quote. End of the session. Otherwise, I'm going to give the last human assignment, starting with the first one, the thoughtistry exercise, asking, how were you raised? What were you taught about your highest nature? What is your highest nature? Were you taught that a materialistic view, that your heart is a pump, your brain is a computer, and your senses are your only access to knowledge? Or were you raised with a sense that there is something more, that you have an eternal nature, that your heart is alive within you, within an alive cosmos? How has the belief you were raised with changed? And is there any way you wish it to change further? The second one is the artistic exercise. It's working with the same exercise as in today's session. Start with a single point, add a second point, a third, creating an equilateral triangle, which is the strongest shape in the universe. Keep adding more single points, so to form more triangles. Watch the form grow into a circle. Have wonder for how what started as a singular point has arrived at a circle. Every geometric form aspires to be a circle. The third one is, any guesses?
Me, please, me.
Go for it.
Rickshaw, yes.
Yes, the Ruckshao. Take a few minutes each day to review the events of your day in reverse order. View yourself from an objective, higher perspective, going through your day backwards. What do you see? What are you shown? What do you learn about yourself? This is a way to strengthen many things, including mental picturing, memory, empathy, and self-knowledge, as well as connection to your higher self. And lastly, a fourth one, which is the same as the fourth one last week, read to the so-called dead. Read with thoughts of those on the other side. Read something uplifting and with spiritual character. Focus not so much on the words, but the sense of the content, adding your own feelings to the meaning. Enjoy the sense of feeding others for their enrichment and upliftment. Observe how your thoughts, consciousness, and dream life may change.